It's my turn to say good evening. Good evening, everybody. Since there are a lot of people who are new in our audience, my name is Mirjana Tomić. I'm a former journalist, and now I organize and moderate seminars and talks on Europe in media for Presseclub Concordia and fjum. And Ivan has been our guest for several years. It's a privilege to always have Ivan, to talk to him and see what will happen, whether we shall have wars or not wars. Vikram, thank you so much for the music, but I really hope it is the music for the soul and not music of the Titanic, because as I was preparing for this evening, I attended two events that were organized by my friend and colleague Ivan Voivoda with top analysts in Europe and the US who are in the room, and it was very difficult to keep the smile and be optimistic, but we shall do our best. I want to thank everybody for coming, but there is one person I want to mention, and we are in a press club, and she is Woman Courage, and this is, get up for a second, this is Galina Timchenko, the co-founder. For those who don't know, Galina is the co-founder of Meduza, the best source of information on Russia in English and in Russian, and she's doing her best to reach the audience in Russia in spite of everything. She's a foreign agent, but the organization has been named Extreme Organization, so in very difficult times, Galina is doing miracles. So I'm so happy you're with us today, Galina. And Ivan, on the one hand, everyone knows you, but what if someone doesn't? So as a journalist, I have to say a few words. Ivan is the chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies and permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, EVM Vienna, founding member of the European Council on Foreign Affairs, member of the Board of Trustees of the International Crisis Group, member of the Board of Directors of Globsec. He's the author of numerous books. Please look in the program, the list of books is there. But there is one thing about Ivan, other than his brilliant analysis, whether he's right or wrong, that we shall decide later, and that is, Ivan is probably the best connected person that I have ever met. Ivan talks to presidents, to ministers, to prime ministers, to advisors. They invite him to hear his opinion. Ivan, we are in Europe facing 2024 between two wars and three elections in Russia, European Parliament, and the US. News avoidance and war fatigue. What can 2024 bring? We heard this morning at the Ivan seminar more than once that 24 is the year of survival. When you meet these presidents and chancellors and advisors, do you have the feeling they have a strategy, and I'm speaking of the Western world, to defend democracy, to guarantee our security, to withstand the far right, to keep peace, and above all, do they have a profound understanding of citizens' concerns? You don't have to name names, just your impression of the people you're meeting. Do you feel safe with them?
Okay, thank you very much. First, I have my Catholic moment, because you know, we are not famous for confessing in the Orthodox religion, so I slightly feel like in a confession. Listen, one of the things that I have learned over the time is that it's not bad to try to respect people who take decisions. When you're giving advices, we are all very smart. The problem is that people are taking decisions. And by the way, in this room, I have seen people who are meeting not less ministers and prime ministers than me, and some of them even have been ministers. So it's not. But one of the things that I want really to say is that all of us are products of our personal histories. And as a Bulgarian who was 25-year-old in 1989, the only thing that I have really learned and which shaped everything that I was reading, doing, writing was how quickly things can change. You cannot imagine how stable the communist Bulgaria looked like in 1989 in the beginning. It was not Poland. It was not Hungary. You had the feeling that you know how your life is going to look like in the next 20 years. And here's the story. The day when the Berlin Wall collapsed, I have been in a restaurant where to be, and there was a person, the best known Bulgarian dissident, Zhelev, and we are several younger people, and he said, "You're going to see the end of communism in your lifetime." 6 months later, he was the president of the country. And by the way, then, years later, I decided to go to the discussion of the Soviet Politburo of their first meeting after the fall of the Berlin Wall to try to see how they have been discussing. And do you know what? The fall of the Berlin Wall was in Varia. It was not perceived as important. They have been focusing on the agricultural reform. Why I'm saying this? Because starting from there, you became very sensitive about the fragility. You know that things can change very fast. And here's my first story about 2024. 2024 started. It's a very long year. In my view, for Europeans, this started with the Polish elections. For the world, it started basically with October 7. And you have this combination between wars and elections, which are really going to shape it. It's not the only 3 elections that you named. By the way, on January 16, Taiwan is going to vote. And the vote in Taiwan is obviously going to affect China's perception of what is going on. It's going to affect probably the dynamic of the Chinese-American relations. Second, even before people voting, governments, when you're asking who they are, they're different people. And I don't believe, probably, are they going to be trusted or not? We're going to know in 10 years. Because some people that have been praised very much during their lifetime suddenly turn out that it didn't end so well. Certain people that have been totally underestimated when they have been there have been after that judged differently. But I'm saying this because at least we know that 2024 is going to be very eventful. And this combination between elections and wars is incredible because many of the politicians who are facing elections are seeing the wars, be it the war in Ukraine, being the war in Gaza, through the way how this is going to affect the election results. And on the other side, basically what is happening on the battlefield, of course, is going to shape things. And I don't believe that ever in human history, this interplay between elections and wars have been so prominent. In the next 12 years, people are going to vote in a country in which half of the world population lives. India, Mexico. Of course, the American elections are going to be. So this is the first thing. And I do believe that this is very difficult, particularly for people who are just doing foreign policy, to understand the interplay between domestic and foreign policy everywhere. Because you look around, and this is the other thing that made a strong impression on me, and where I do believe that the world has changed. When the war starts, traditionally you expect you're going to have certain level of national unity, even political parties that have been basically going against each other. But then suddenly you see that the most important wars in a certain war is the internal war of battles that you see. Look at what is happening in the American Congress. Obviously, the most important war for them is going to be the elections. And I do believe this is important, and this is new, and the fact that paradoxically this is also the result of the democratization of the world. People are voting. Suddenly, public's emotions of the public sentiments. For Europeans also, what I do believe from time to time we don't realize is that out of the 2 wars, in Russia, Ukraine, and Gaza, the global one is the Gaza war. I'm just going to give you one effect. If you compare the social media activity in a country like Brazil in the first 3 weeks of the Gaza war, you're going to see 4 times more social media activity than in the first 3 weeks of the Russia-Ukrainian war. Russia-Ukrainian war is by far the most important for Europeans. But all this is new, and suddenly you're forced to see the world with different eyes.
I'm sorry, Ivan, I'm going to stop you. This was going to be my question. Which one of the two wars is more important for Europe? On the one hand, it is the war in Ukraine, but also what happened in Gaza, the anti-Semitism and anti-Islam, the political consequences of the war in Gaza are enormous.
The real problem with the war in Gaza is going to be the divisions within Europe. The war in Ukraine, to a certain extent, at least for a while, unified Europeans. Because it was also, but also don't forget, I'm going to, from time to time, to give you kind of figures in order to imagine what we're talking about. One of the things that made a very strong impression on me, I was talking to the Russian colleagues, pollsters from the Levada Center, and they told me that in the period 2018-2021, almost 70% of the Russian population believed that the World War III is going to start in the next 10 years. There was a very strong apocalyptic expectations. And one of the things that I do believe, and for myself, I'm blaming myself very much, we also totally underestimated the impact of COVID on the world imagination. Listen, the last time I was in Russia was in October 2021, just months before the war, and this was Sochi, and the president was there. The name of the conference was Pandemic as a Substitute for War. Why I'm telling you, in a certain way, for different reasons, different groups, for Europe, but for by far, the Russian-Ukrainian war is critically important. And the Russian-Ukrainian war is critically important because in a certain way, and I have said this several times, it put into question the three major assumptions on which European security was based. First, economic interdependence can secure peace. If you're trading with somebody intensively, there's not going to be a war. And now we can say anything about how naive it was. Naive, European Union was based on this for 70 years and it worked. And suddenly it didn't work. Second thing is that military power doesn't matter. Europeans, we managed to convince ourselves that military power doesn't matter, and one of the reasons was that we saw Americans being very powerful, what they achieved in Iraq. So you say what really matters is economic power and soft power, and basically this is what Europe went on. And this is part of the problem. And the third thing, which in my view was also critically important to understand, is that also the war in Ukraine, and particularly the capability of the Ukrainians to resist, challenge one more important assumption in European politics, and this is the mobilizing power of civic nationalism. Because it was a nationalism in action. They were defending their country. This was not about universal values that are there. And I'm saying all this because if you're a European, suddenly you are threatened by your successes. Pacification of the European mind was one of the biggest successes ever. One of the famous historians' book is called Where All Soldiers Have Gone. And suddenly you look for these soldiers. So as a result of it, for Europeans, it's important. But the problem with Gaza is that, and this is my last point on this, Jews, for very clear historical reasons, in the post-World War II European imagination, are the classical victim. European, not by accident, the last chapter of Tony Judd's famous book, Post-War, is on the importance of the Holocaust in building European identity. So all European, all kind of European identity politics as a project is based on this. Outside of the West, Palestinians had absolutely the same symbolic place. They are basically perceived as the ultimate victim. So you don't simply have the clash of two propagandas. You have a clash of two different political identities. And then comes what you're saying, that in different countries, for example, in places like Brazil, one of the reasons that there was so much interest was also because evangelical community is very strongly in support of Israel. In places like India, it's a very strong support for Israel, for their own reasons. And as a result of it, I do believe that people, I don't know how many people really follow what is happening in Gaza. I don't know how many of us really can understand, but this becomes a symbolic politics in which you go with your identity, and for European Union, this was a crisis that basically paralyzed the European Union. we cannot get a common position. Because if you're a German politician, the moment, basically, anti-Semitism is going to be perceived as being legitimate, all post-war identity of Germany is done. So when they were going, and I believe that this type of different levels where you have the military conflict and suddenly the military conflict triggered the deeper political identity of a post-war world, this is something that is very different than what we're seeing in other conflicts, because there were no conflicts all these years.
Well, let's let's separate the two wars. Do you think, I have to make a reference to this morning and some of the analysis I heard this morning, Europe has not woken up to the threat of Russia. Europe is not ready to support Ukraine more than it has, or we just don't realize how important it is to support Ukraine. According to the Austrian military analyst Markus Reisner, he only takes the military aspect. If you want to produce more weapons, you have to declare war economy. A year ago, in this very room, we had Joe Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner, who was the American economist, who was also talking about the war economy. Question to you, Ivan, is Europe ready to give everything it takes to support Ukraine? Does Europe have vision and strategy? Ukraine wins, Ukrainian territory is divided, Russia wins. Are there three strategies, or let's see what happens?
Okay. First, let's start with the fact there is this famous book, Africa is not a country. Europe is not a country too. And one of the biggest problems of Europe is that you have different history, different stories. One of the stories is the following. If you see these five different, because with the colleagues we have been trying to do the following and also doing some opinion polling. When you ask the question, do you believe that NATO, United States, Europe are in a war with Russia? Every single country, either majority or plurality outside of the West, is going to say yes. Of course, Russians, but I'm talking Chinese, Indians, Indonesians, Brazilians. The only two places in which people do not believe that they're in a war with Russia. In Europe, and particularly in the United States, where 70% don't believe that they're in a war with Russia. By the way, more Chinese believe that NATO is in a war with Russia than Russians. And this is it's very difficult to win the war in which you believe that you're not participating. And this is one reality. The second reality, which in my view is extremely important, is that countries are very divided when they see Russia as a threat. And here going to be, when again you go to the opinion polling, one of the interesting stories that I see is the return of the old empires. For example, if you talk to the Poles or the Balts, the question is, okay, if President Putin is going to have a breakfast in Kiev, where he's going to have a lunch? For them, it's very much about them. But basically, if you come to a place like Bulgaria or Greece, not that anybody really likes what the Russians are doing. By the way, Bulgaria, on the level of the government now, is providing a lot of ammunition. But public opinion, 70% said we should not be involved. And then you go Czech Republic, Hungary. Suddenly you see countries that have been part of the old Russian Empire, not of the Soviet one, totally identify with what's happening in Ukraine. Others, they sympathize to Ukraine, but at the same time, and this is not East-West divide only, this is the East-East divide. And also when you ask the question what you really fear, in the West, they fear nuclear war. In Poland, they fear occupation. This is not the same fear. And I'm saying this because the biggest problem with the Ukraine, you say what it means winning. For different story, in order to mobilize their own population, Ukrainian government insisted that victory can mean only recovering all the territories that have been occupied, including Crimea. The truth is that not many in Europe believe that this is the most likable development. So, even if you don't believe it, can you say this to people who basically are fighting? And this is, you cannot. But of course now, and this is one of the interesting things that happened and we missed. One of the biggest success of Russia was, and of Russian government I mean, that they managed to totally reformulate the war in which they are and what is a victory. When President Putin, and Galina and many other people know more than me, declared the war and invaded Ukraine, first it came a bigger surprise to some of the Russian population and the Russian elite than to the Western elite. Because at least our intelligence agencies have been telling us in the last months. But secondly, he really believed that it's a special operation that should end in 6 weeks. Special operation ended in September 2022, when the partial mobilization was declared. And then suddenly, Russian government totally changed the rhetoric. It is not a war with Ukraine anymore. It is the war with the West and NATO. It is on the territory of Ukraine, but it is not the war with Ukraine. Secondly, President Putin does not speak about victory. He talks about never-ending war. And
what does that mean exactly?
Listen, in the State of the Union, the problem with President Putin is that, in my view, he should be taken literally. But we don't know how to basically believe what people are telling us. To be honest, he's not particularly truthful when he talks about the past, but when he talks about the future, you should trust him. He will do what he's saying he will do. And in this case, he made the State of the Union address. In the State of the Union address, not much talk about Ukraine. There were 3 major points. First, we're in a war, and this war is not going to end up soon. Secondly, I promise you that nevertheless that we're in a war, you're not going to lose your living standards and so on. Thirdly, every Russian soldier is going to have the right every 6 months to spend 2 weeks home. This is not the definition of victory. He didn't say we're going to be in Kiev on this or this story. I'm saying this because the idea of the never-ending war, and by the way, for part of the Russian population, they said, but we know this. It's like the Cold War. It's there. Of course, people are dying. And in my view, this is on our side. We said we are supporting Ukraine of anything that Ukraine is doing. And part of European support was based on the fact that in the beginning we so much mistrusted the power of the Ukrainians to defend themselves. So when basically the first counteroffensive came, the miracle of the success. Listen, nothing changes public opinion like miracles. Something that is unexpected. The level of trust, this is, from my point of view, it's very important to repeat this. When the war started, Americans were quite right on what Russians will do. But believe me, they also believe that the Ukrainians are not going to survive for more than 5 or 6 weeks. So from this point of view, there was such a consensual mistrust in the capability of the Ukrainian society, of the Ukrainian armed forces, of the Ukrainian. And when this happened, we went on the other extreme. We started to behave like Ukrainians are not human, that they can do anything, that we should not be interested in the fact that, militarily speaking, the chances for the counteroffensive to succeed were very minimal for anybody who was reading anything. And then the fact that Ukrainians can be bombed for 2 years, and this is not going to have psychological impact. We totally lost an interest in what is happening in the Ukrainian society. For example, everybody has his small obsessions. I follow the divorce rates. And listen, these are people. And do you know that in the last months, the level of divorces went up 3 times? Do you know what it is to be on the front line and to get a letter that basically part of your family is not going? So I'm saying all this because part of the story is we created a narrative which is very good for us. We are not in the war. We are helping Ukraine. Ukraine is going to win. We are not going to touch what the victory means because they have the right to define this. And then suddenly, what is happening these days, we're saying, but we're disappointed with the Ukrainians. Why they are not winning? It's difficult for us. We don't have money. We also have suffering. And this is a very difficult, by the way, on psychological level, you don't want to be in Kiev these days, seeing what is happening in the Congress in the United States. And by the way, I don't know their colleagues here who really follow much closer. I'm going to 90% talking about predictions, that while probably the European Union is going to get an agreement on financial support for Ukraine, they're not going to be an opening of negotiations with Ukraine. So This is the story, and this kind of a crisis of self-confidence, on which level we are saying that everything has changed, but honestly speaking, not much has changed. And when you're asking the story of how we are our leaders, they're in between. I was talking to prime ministers that have been in the room when on 24th, basically Zelensky addressed them. And to be honest, and this was amazing because these people, peacetime prime minister, they're seeing somebody, and Zelensky told them, probably I'm seeing you for the last time on the video. And they did things that they could not imagine that they would do. For people, and I see here several people with policy experience, freezing Russian state assets in the Western Bank is a nuclear option. This is very strong attack on the international system because somebody has given you money, their money to keep them. So one of the reasons, I was talking after that to Russian colleagues, I said, why you kept your money with us? And they said, but we have an intelligence information that you are never discussing this possibility. They were right. But then something happened dramatically, and you see different world. But then people tend to normalize. This is like in our own life. During the first days of COVID, do you remember what we have been doing, how we are seeing the world? And suddenly you adjust your normality. The problem is, and this is the problem of 2024, the illusion of normality cannot be kept anymore. This is going to be a year in which, even if you're forcing yourself to believe that we're in a normal situation, it is not there.
But what is going to happen if you read nowadays American media? Let's start just address the American elections. It is a doomsday scenario if you read liberal American media. The article of Kagan the other day, it is like, if Trump wins, don't fool yourselves, we are speaking about dictatorship. So if Trump wins, is Europe prepared for that option?
No, Europe is not prepared, but in a certain way, it's not also easy to say what it means to be prepared. So let's also face it, because we go to our leaders and to expect to what extent we are prepared in our personal lives. We all have this conversation, come to these talks, but did you move your money somewhere? Did you buy property somewhere? So in a certain way, why you expect your prime minister to be so smarter than you? I do believe that we know that something dramatic is happening, but on the other side, and this is, before when I was saying this, it was a bad news. Now it's a good news. Before people said, but history does not have a direction. And now the good news is history does not have a direction. Which means that basically, also when people are asking this pessimism, optimism question all the time, I saw a great quote by Nietzsche, who said that the only disagreement between the pessimists and the optimists is on the final date. And obviously the United States and the change in the United States is going to be dramatic change for everybody. And for the European Union, it's going to be dramatic change. In economic terms, by the way, Europe, more than the United States and China, is exposed to the crisis of the global economic system because we have a much more open economies, we have been much more trading with others. We have been the winners of the previous round. And the winners of the previous round are always the most vulnerable when the situation is changing. And this is structurally, and everyone in a way knows it. How this is going to work, listen, God knows. There's a lot of time to come. We don't know even at the end of the day who is going to run, how the elections will go. But people already imagine the world in which Trump is winning. I was recently, this could be probably interesting for some people, European Council of Foreign Relations has a program about the United States, and we went and had a talk with some of the staffers of the American senators that have been voting against the Ukrainian aid. And to be honest, it was extremely interesting experience. It's a younger people, between 30 and 40, and believe me, very different than what you imagine. This was people who very much reminded me of the American left in the 1970s. They were totally against the war, against any war. It was not about Ukraine, they said the same, it was after October 7, it was about Israel. Their major message was America should go back home. American troops should get out of Europe. You're big enough, you're rich enough, take care of yourself. And most of these people have been veterans. They have been serving in the army. And one of them said, keep in mind, the young Republicans are not patriotic anymore. We believe that for 20 years, we have been taking care for everybody in the world, but who cares about America? And listen, it shocked me so much, and Galina will know what I'm saying. This was the conversation that I remember from the early 1990s in Soviet Union. You're taking care of everybody. Why we're giving to Cuba? Why we're doing this? Why we're doing that? Listen, this is not the only people, but this was a generation. This was the staffers of Senator Vance and other people. And this is very important. They're not saying, by the way, they're not pro-Russian. Even on China, where there is much more hostility, you're not seeing these people wanted to be number one in the world. They have the feeling that something went wrong. And when you ask them, is there one war worth fighting? They said, yes, there is one war against the deep state. And deep state is not Biden. Deep state is this mystical kind of a combination between the big technology companies, between big bureaucracies, between big businesses. Listen, there is something in what they're saying. But what struck me with these people is that they cannot see the world with the eyes of a state, with a government. And this is going to be the major story. They're very kind of highly motivated. And for Europe, this is going to be a big change.
Yeah, but can you just, God, the time is flying. It's over there. We can see it on the top. There is a clock.
Yeah.
But what has it been in practical terms for Europe? Can Europe be supplying enough weapons? Will Europe be supporting? Will all countries be? Today we were hearing, or I was hearing for the first time, we are losing this war. Is Russia winning this war? What is your take?
Listen, it's extremely important how you're going to define lose and victory. In a certain way, if you compare with our expectations in the beginning of the war, we're overperforming. Do we believe that basically Ukraine can, in the next 6 months, year and a half, be able to recover all the territories that they have? No, but to be honest, I was never believing this, as you know. I always believed that they're going to be a Korean scenario. But this is conversations that we are talking on behalf of the Ukrainians. And the biggest story is that they're fighting the war. We're not fighting the war. When you say, do we have ammunition? So let's give you the following. Do you know that North Korea annually is producing more shells than the United States and Europe together? North Korea. Russia managed to go on the war economy. Listen, some of their products are not high-tech products, but I was recently talking to Alexander Goltz, one of the Russian military commentator, and he told me the following. He said, Ivan, your civilization is totally preoccupied with quality, technologically. But he said, quantity matters. And he said, I have been spent all my life commenting on military stuff. He said, in a war, from time to time, it is better to have 3 old Soviet tanks than 1 Leopard. And what you're seeing on the front line is that Russia is totally dominating on the level of quantity. Ammunitions, they managed to mobilize people. By the way, they managed to mobilize people in the same time they organize vaccination. Everything goes, by the way, through market, through money. It's a totally interesting story of redistribution of money within the Russian society as a result of the war. And as a result of it, we are not in a war economy. And it is not easy to be in a war economy because European Union is not one economy. When we decide to invest in producing shells, the first story is in which country the production is going to be put. It is as simple as this. France and Germany cannot agree on this. And by the way, the biggest luck for Ukraine is that some of East European countries, starting with my own, didn't manage to close on time their military-industrial complex. Now almost 30% of the old 155 shells is coming from countries like Bulgaria or Serbia. In a certain way, if you're a military-industrial complex, you always want to produce the most expensive item. You want to produce something that costs billion, which is very small, which is cheap. On the other side, I do believe that European Union is starting to change, and you're seeing on certain places. Polish military budget now is 4%, and before going, there is one positive thing which really, in my view, should be estimated. The change of Poland is important for Europe on several levels. First of all, Donald Tusk is probably the only East European politician that knows European Union. He was for 8 years the president of the Council, not knowing about what his country wants. By the way, it does not mean that Poland is going to be the same like Germany and France. He's a tough political. Secondly, he's an ambitious politician. One of the things that you see is the lack of ambition. If you basically go beyond Viktor Orban, who is an ambitious politician, you can like or dislike his policy, but you cannot contest his ambition. You're going to see that Tusk is the one that is really trying to make something. And thirdly, Tusk is the only political leader in Poland. If Trump comes, he's going to bet on Europe, not on the United States. And you cannot imagine how big difference it is. Because for Poland, betting on the United States is traditional. I mean, for very good reasons. Not that he's going to bet against the United States. But I do believe that the fact, and this is something that is changing dramatically. In the previous elections, the story was who is going to exit the EU. After Brexit, you remember 17 parties in European Union have been asking for referendums. Now, even on the far right, they moved from exit to voice. Nobody wants to exit the EU, but there are different ideas who wants to run the EU and how the European Union is going to look like. And this is going to be changed, and the wars and the elections are going to change exactly this.
Two more questions, and then I open for the questions of the audience. When you said the far right, it is expected that the far right will advance in Austria, in Germany, and in the the elections of the European Union. What do you think will be this impact of the far right, of the increase of the presence of the far right in Europe on daily politics and on the situation, on the relations with Russia and Ukraine?
Listen, when certain party goes above certain percent, we stop calling them far right. Look, when for the last time Meloni was called far right. So, and this is
but
the reality.
It doesn't mean they don't have far-right policies.
I'm saying this, but this is a very important story because you are adjusting politically, and this is one of the language stories. First of all, you're going to call them first hard right, and then basically. Secondly, you want to ask me as if all these countries basically, and these parties know exactly what they'll do. Two things have changed dramatically for the last 5 years. 5 years ago, before European elections, migration was the divisive issue, and climate was kind of a unifying and consensual. Now this is the other way around. There is a consensus on migration, and there is a division on the green policies, particularly on the backlash against the Green Deal. On the other side, if you look at Meloni, you're going to see that there was a discursive change, but the change was much at this moment, much more timid than what you expected. I was talking to some of the Italian colleagues, asking just one question: is it better or worse than we expected? And they said, for the moment, better. Can this change? It can change. And by the way, this is part of the Trump effect. Trump is going to change the nature of the political parties, of the discourse. Because one of the disciplining things for the far right is the United States. I was talking to one of the advisors of Mrs. Meloni and said, why are you so supportive on Ukraine? I read the opinion polls. This is not where your voters are. And he said, first, because she wants to kill Salvini, and the best place to kill him is in Kiev, because she didn't have a relations with. And secondly, because she wanted to show to the United States that she's a reliable partner. Okay, imagine a different United States, and then you're going to have a different Meloni. So from this point of view, it's not simply what all these politicians are also going to be shaped by what is happening in these countries and other countries. Secondly, the far right has a totally different reactions, and this is critically important to see. For example, in Germany, the level of fear of AfD is incomparable with any other places, because history plays. Because in a certain way, European Union was based in a moment in which we feared the past and hoped for the future. The problem is that now we start to fear both the past and the future. And I don't believe that you can answer this question as if I know. Yes, I do believe that in many countries you're going to have parties entering governments. One thing is over, and this is basically far-right cannot be isolated in most of the places. This sanitaire cordon sanitaire that was famous didn't work, even more in France because of Gaza, what we saw. What was isolated was the far left on this anti-Semitism, basically manifestations and others. And my point is, why we are focusing just on the percentages of this party, something much more profound is happening. They are changing others. The real question is what is going to happen to the center-right. Mm-hmm. The most important question is, because of also polarization, what is going to happen to the center-left. This is not simply how many votes they're going to get. The problem is how they're changing others. And my understanding is that we're going to enter in a different type of European politics. It's going to be more and more difficult to have a grand coalitions anymore, because polarization is making it very difficult acceptable. And this is going to be a difficult period, simply. I do believe it's a difficult period.
Well, very uplifting.
So let's give you some statistic. At the moment, there was Eurostat just come with the data. Bulgarians and Germans are the most unhappy people
No,
in Europe
Austrians are
today.
the happiest.
And the happiest are the Austrians. So I cannot feel guilty. You're so happy anyway. So.
There is one more question, and I open that is very important to me, and that has to do with the freedom of expression and cancel culture. Both wars had an impact on the freedom of speech. This is my very personal view. At the beginning of the war in Ukraine, it wasn't well seen to criticize anything that had to do with Ukraine. Now, when the things have changed, now you can do it. The New York Times does it, other media do it. Now it is allowed. Then starts the war between Israel and Hamas. And now, again, there is sort of a censorship. You're supposed to say this, or you're not supposed. People are being canceled. Is our press freedom, our freedom of expression so fragile? I have even read some articles these days. Will they tell us what we are supposed to say?
I'm not the great person to comment. I don't have social media at all. And this is obviously a different experience. Also, there is a major generational change. From where I'm coming, I don't understand this, simply. Not, for example, all my life, we have been taught that one of the most important things is to engage with people who do not share your views. This was a type of socialization. And by the way, for me, this is critically important. Now, when you try to look back again and try to make sense, people always try to distinguish between democracy, authoritarianism, and I have this joke that I invented that I'm very happy with, because I really believe that there is a major difference between, what is the difference between pornography and authoritarianism? You know this famous definition of the American Supreme Court, that we don't know what is pornography, but we're sure that we recognize it when we see it. With authoritarianism these days is that we can define it easily, but I'm not sure that we're going to recognize it when we see it. But I'm saying this because I start to distinguish between people that have been socialized in the moments in which society is opening and in the moments in which society is closing. From time to time, and probably this is not very optimistic, I am happy that being born in a non-democratic society in the moment of opening, because I do believe that even in a democratic society, in a moment of closing,
and that's what you live. Yeah. That's where you live now.
Yeah, you have this, and you start basically fearing what others are going to say, why they are going to say this. Virtue signaling. I'm not going to allow to listen to anybody who disagree with me. But I know for the younger generation, and we talk to our kids, it's more complicated. They had the feeling that everything became too relativistic, that everything is too easy to be justified. They much more try to position themselves on everything. Listen, I don't have a sympathy for this. Secondly, I don't have a sympathy also for one thing, and we can see it on all these conflicts. To claim that there is something is simple, that there is no complexity. Or secondly, to cancel people simply because of their ethnicity, I find totally wrong. We had a call with the Ukrainian colleagues, and listen, you're not moralizing on people who are bombed on a daily basis while you're staying in your apartment. But when I was told that the daughter of Navalny was not allowed to speak on a conference in a university, listen, there's certain things that are basically human. The guy is staying in prison. You can like his politics, dislike his politics, but not to allow his daughter to be on a panel, there is something deeply wrong. And in my view, deeply wrong is for a very important reason, because we start to discount the political choices that people are doing. Different people in different societies, and this is the same with Gaza, and this is the same with what's happening in Israel or Palestinians. The most difficult these days is, if you're Palestinian, to attack Hamas. And if you're Israeli, seeing basically what is happening in your society, to be critical to your government. And this is the tradition of communist dissent. Don't forget, most of the dissidents were coming from communist families. Standing against your own was the real courage. And I don't have the feeling that we're kind of socializing our kids to have basically the courage to state not against their enemies, but against their friends when they disagree with them.
Thank you, Ivan. I hope questions, and whoever wants to ask a questions, please introduce yourself, because we are recording and we shall share the recording. So I don't see any questions. Frane, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Frane Marojevic. I work at the International Press Institute. I have two questions that I'll be interested in. So one is, I cannot understand the fascination by many Eastern Europeans about Russia. People who have a history of bad history with Russia are now fascinated. Can you explain that? And the second one is, if you were Putin, where would you start the next conflict? Because I think he needs conflicts in order to continue. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take one more, and then I don't see nobody. No one dares ask a question? Okay, well, everything is clear.
Yes.
Go ahead, Ivan.
Yeah, fascination with Russia. Let's tell you something about Bulgarian society. Where traditionally, first of all, different East European society has a different Russia relations. Bulgaria was part of the Ottoman Empire, Russia was part of the Liberation War. But and you have a quite high level of support. I'm not talking about Russian culture, but even for President Putin, you can go 25-30%. But when you look at these people, the most amazing is that most of them have never been to Russia. They don't speak Russian language. Why? Because Russia became this kind of an empty space in which you're putting your disappointment, dissatisfaction with the West, this kind of anti-Western utopia. And this is so strong because in a country like Bulgaria that normally you're going to see as pro-Russian, when the Russian embassy offered 1,000 fellowships for young people to go to study, they didn't manage to find 1,000 people to go to study. So this is the problem with, but there is something which goes slightly deeper, and this is, it has generational, and also it has part of East Europe. President Putin is an East European man of a certain generation. Certain things that are happening in the world are dramatically traumatic for him. When he's talking about, for example, American gender politics or this and that, this is not simply a tactical, cynical talk. He believes that only in the world in which your son can become your daughter, Ukrainians are not Russians. This world in which people can choose everything is scaring him. And this is a scary of a world that you don't understand. And I'm saying this because people talk about the Cold War, but there is one important thing about the Cold War in which we are missing. First, Cold War was the peak of the Western influence, because both sides has their ideologies rooted in the European Enlightenment, and the problem was who is the legitimate son. But secondly, in the Cold War, the West was the conservative modernity. Because the Soviets has two things that were really radical. One is they were against God, and secondly, they're against private property. And when you go to non-Western societies, you're going to see certain groups that are going to basically go anti-Soviet and anti-communist dramatically because of the fact that they respect God and because people with property fear this. What happened in the modern world, Western liberalism is the radical option. And this is not because of God and property, but because this is very much about on the level of sexual relations, gender identities, and others. And in many parts of the world, and this is where people like Putin and others really starting to attack the West. And by the way, they're attacking the West with the same words. In the 1920s, the Soviet Union was attacked, that it is against nature, that this is something kind of a totally ununderstandable, that they're going to destroy human civilization. I'm saying this because in many of our societies, you have these traditional relations. Because the difference, if you look even on the far right, there is one major difference between far right in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe. Far right in Western Europe is post-1968. Look at Netherlands. You're going to talk about, for example, the new far right there, but none of them is going to go against gay people. Some of the leaders of the far right party have been gay persons themselves. East European far right is a full package. We are on everything, because just 1968 came together with 1989. It was totally different type of a cultural change. And in my view, this is where Putin finds people. Listen, also, there is money interest. Russian money have been very, one of the interesting stories was that Russian foreign policy was so weak in the 1990s that they outsourced to the Russian companies. And corruption became a very influential story. Listen, a lot of Russian money are going. I was always trying, and I see Tim Judd, and he probably can explain it better than me, but one of the reasons why the British society went, in my view, so tough on personal sanctions is that some of the British elite went so close to the Russian oligarchs, so much money have been exchanged, that you want to put blood in your hand in order to convince your people that that's the end, because they went against lovers and so on, which is slightly excessive. So I'm saying all this because this cultural story, this combination of imagined anti-Western position combined with corruption, money influence, but also this fear of cultural change, of the world that is changing so fast that you have the feeling that it's a big conspiracy. I found this very important, and this is why one of the fear of all these regimes is what you're doing with the young people. How basically you're dealing with your own use.
The second question was, where is he going next?
Listen, he's not going to stop the war, but he now defined the war in the way that it's never going to stop. If you're fighting NATO, you can fight till the end. I don't believe that at this moment the Russian president or the Russian government will be very much interested to cross a border. I mean, and NATO is NATO with everything that you can see. But what you can expect is that he's going to declare victory any moment when the money and weapons don't go to Ukraine. And one of the reasons the weapons don't go is that we don't have the weapons. And the other paradox is that if you listen to countries, what they say and what they do, people like to be critical of the Germans, but talk to the Ukrainian military and you're going to see that at least Germans delivered what they promised. Many of our countries basically are saying things, and then Germany now is doing bilaterally almost as much as all the EU member states together. And if you see how much is given, France is on the 15th place.
I see one hand, and the first one hand here, Sol, and then Stephanie.
Hello, Soli Özel from Istanbul. Ivan, thank you. My question is about the Gaza war, which you called a global war, which I concur with. And I can understand why it was important to concentrate on Ukraine, because it is the immediate problem. But I think the Gaza war challenges Europe at least on two levels. There are anywhere between 15 to 20 million Muslims living in Europe. Some of them have been citizens of their country of residence for a very long time. And the universalist claims of the West, and particularly Europe, have been, in my judgment, devastated at a time when global power competition also encompasses whether or not you can appeal to non-great countries, the so-called global South. So the moral authority of the European project and the Western project in general have been harmed. This will have both international and, I think, domestic repercussions. So perhaps in the long run, this is a far deeper harming dynamic than maybe even the Ukraine one.
Thank you so much.
Totally solid. Okay. Because this is an extremely important question. I'll go on 2 minutes, but listen, I very much agree with you, and it's going to be really divisive on several levels. There was this conference in Doha just some days ago in which the German Foreign Minister Baerbock gave a speech talking about universal values, and then basically the former Pakistani Foreign Minister went up and said, "You were talking about the feminist foreign policy. What about the kids and women being killed in Gaza?" And I'm saying this because one of the things that should change to Europe, this pretense of having universalist discourse, in my view, is going to die. It's very difficult. The problem is that hypocrisy also, if you are non-Western power, and you want to show the hypocrisy of the West, better go against Europe than the United States. For many reasons. But for the Europeans, the problem of what is happening in Gaza is becoming domestic and very much migration-centered. When President Macron was talking about his fear that the war can spread, he didn't mean Lebanon. He meant Paris. And I do believe this is going to affect our migration policy dramatically. I very much agree with you that on the level of the domestic cohesion of society, and secondly, you're going to see also the divide between East and West. Because in Eastern Europe, it's much more, and listen, you should try to understand that if there is a dream country for some of these European nationalists, this is Israel. This is a small country, economically extremely successful, technologically extremely developed. Demographically, this is the only Western society that managed to reverse the demographic decline. Nuclear power. Democracy, but ethnic democracy. So when people are telling me that, for example, Mr. Orban or Mr. Kaczynski before are imitating Putin or Trump, listen, this is a joke. You cannot imitate neither Putin nor Trump. If you don't have oil and nuclear, don't imitate Putin. The model was Netanyahu. And what happened in Israel is also dramatically crisis because you see to what extent the polarization of society became a national security threat. And I agree very much with you, at the long term it can turn out, but the worst is that these two wars are going to go together, that they're going to interplay all the time, and this is going to go external threat, internal threat, and this is why 2024 is going to be in a certain way so eventful.
Stephanie?
Yes, thank you very much, Stephanie Fenke at International Institute for Peace. My question is actually quite similar to the one which was already asked before, so it would have made sense maybe that I just add. My question would be if we look at the situation now with Israel and Gaza and also comparing to what happened within the European Union or the Western world in general when we had like this very common stance, as you mentioned quite rightfully, when it came to Ukraine. How do we actually access this and how are the repercussions when we talk at all about something like we call international rules-based order? Is there something still left of so-called values, or do we just need to accept that there is nothing like values? Is it only interest-based any longer? And what does this actually mean? And if we think, and if we say so, and very unfortunately, I do believe we are in this phase already. I mean, many would say we have been there before, but I mean, now it's thrown at our face, I would say, from different parts of the world, even from within our countries. What do we do against it? I mean, is there even something we can do against it? Do we need another catastrophe as we had in the Second World War, when we then can come together, uniting and saying, never again? Because I don't see this, very unfortunately, these days. But thank you very much, by the way, also for this super comprehensive, very interesting lecture before.
Thank you very much. I'll try to make my last argument on this, because we, as I said, ECFR, we have been really polling a lot. And one of the things that I found revealing, and of course, listen, opinion polls is not something that you should trust, but they're giving you feeling of how people experience the world. We talk about order, and by the way, in my view, European Union spent a lot of time defending that status quo that did not exist anymore. If somebody could be critical, for example, to somebody like, Chancellor Merkel, is that for such a long time, because we were such a beneficiary of this status quo, we pretend that everything that is happening is deviation and the world is going back where it was. And now we know it's not going to go back. Listen, in most of these places, people don't think in terms of order because they don't believe that it was an order even before. You have a new powers, countries like India, Turkey, Brazil, highly ambitious. For them, the definition of sovereignty is you have choices. So when the Americans said, define, take position on the Russia-Ukraine, and listen, morally, Russia-Ukraine is not a difficult case. Former imperial country is invading a neighbor, the same culture, nothing easier in a way in the world. And they said, no, we are not going for camps anymore. We want to have options. We want American security guarantees, but at the same time, we want to trade with China. For them, their relevance in the world, their own strategies, their activism. And as a result of it, we started to believe, and we're calling this country saying they're sitting on the fence. And my argument is, who is sitting? Is Erdogan sitting? They're the most active part of the international community. Some of the things that they're doing make sense. Others are totally counterproductive. But you're going to have this hyper-activism of middle powers that try to assert themselves in the international order, taking position here and there because of Sofia. Erdogan, he tries to be really the bride in every wedding and the corpse in every funeral. Why? Because basically activism is the life of asserting himself. And you can see this with India. And you're seeing this basically with Brazil on different level. Much more regional centers, and this fragmentation of the economic world we're talking about. Change of the supply chains. And as a result of it, I do believe paradoxically, we went to a situation in which, unfortunately, Russians have been before very nostalgic for the Cold War period. Because they were superpower, they knew how. We also became slightly nostalgic for the Cold War because the West won it. So in a certain way, we're telling these stories, and because the United States is really kind of the most powerful country in the world, no doubt on this, they believe that they have the power to force others to see this frame, choosing between us and them and so on. No, you're going to have fragmentation. This fragmentation is going to be polarized. And in my view, and I know that in Austria this doesn't sound well, but we believe that multipolar world is also multilateral world. In my view, we're going to see a multipolar world in the absence of multilateralism. And here the problem of the European Union is how to learn to be a middle power. And it's not going to be easy, because the values is the only language that we have as a common. Otherwise, if you're going to defend just, you cannot defend EU values so simply as a national values, particularly if you're not talking only in economic terms.
Any more questions? I can take the last question.
Kadri.
Go ahead. And please introduce yourself.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Hanna. Cellist, Ukrainian Prism. I'm wondering why most of the Western experts are trying to glorify Navalny and to make such a secret vision of the victim from him. He's in prison. He's anti-Putin, but that was his choice to be in the prison, let's be honest. He could avoid it. But at the same time, he is the same imperialist as Putin. In 2014, he absolutely supported Crimean annexation. Even more, he was saying that Crimea is not the sandwich to give it back. During Ilovaisk, I just found that tweet and can quote it. It's very difficult to translate because it is in the very slang, offended Russian language, but saying that Hochols, it is very offended towards Ukrainians. Yes, they are now encircled by the Russian forces. It's not the rebellions. And if to eliminate them, he is using these words, that will be the Russian forces to do it. So he was absolutely open about this all these 9 years. But now he is the big hero just because he spoke against the corruption in the Russian state. And his team is saying each time that, Russia cannot be defeated, cannot lose. So most of them are supporting the war, saying that maybe it was not the best decision, but we need to win this war. So why it is such a craziness with this image? Just because we don't have alternative images of the opposition in Russia, or it is just easier for us to pretend that it is opposition in Russia?
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I can take one last one, and then we are please.
Thank you. I'm Kadri Liik, IWM Europe Futures Fellow, also ECFR Policy Fellow. And I had a question about, Europe defending status quo that doesn't function anymore. I've been reading OECFR papers offered among other people by you recently. The suggestion that emerges is to become more transactional in a good way in our dealings with the world. So what in your view does it take for Europe to actually adapt to a world where it can no longer set norms and values? And how will that adaptation be different in Western parts of Europe and Eastern parts? Because Western part has long invested into that sort of normative view, but sometimes my feeling is that, East got it readily made, but became a very dogmatic defender, especially more hawkish part of the East. I come from Estonia, and in my country, but also neighboring Sweden, sometimes liberal order is treated as a God-given natural state of things, and any digressions need to be punished. That reaction manifests not universally. Always when you mention Russia, not necessarily when you mention some other things, but still, I sense very certain difference between certain Eastern and Western approaches too.
Thank you so much. And so these were the last two questions.
Thank you very much. And listen, all of them are very important. On the Navalny story, it's not about Navalny, to be absolutely honest. It's about something much deeper. It's one thing to say that you disagree with Navalny and you can make it on a panel. It's totally different to say, I'm not going to allow anybody who basically comes from there and has not done this and this and this to be on the panel. And secondly, do you really expect, if there are going to be democratic politics in Russia any day, believe me that people who are going to be in this politics are not going to have the same view of the world like the Ukrainians. This is part of the national politics. And is it going to be Navalny or somebody else? If you want to get into a politics in which you want to get back to talk to your voters, you can want and very much insist that you want Putin's regime to be destroyed, that you want to be defeated. But do you really believe that there is a Russian politician that can be supported by the population if he goes and said, I want Russia to be disintegrated? How realistic is this? And my idea is, this is like going in your own countries and pushing people to do this, and there are people coming here. We have seen this in former Yugoslavia. You have in these stories. Even the politicians with the highest credentials, what you're telling me, for example, about Navalny, I remember the same talk having with Kosovars about Djindjic. Yes, he's not going to be Ukrainian. And you have all the reasons to disagree with him, to criticize it. It's not difficult to criticize Navalny, but it is totally unrealistic to believe that you can expect that any Russian simply to adopt not the position on the war, but on the future of the country. This is not realistic. This never worked like this. And in my view, when you go with this story, what is going to happen is that for a while it works when everybody is interested, and then disappears, and this disappears because all these people, they want to convince their own population. We have been talking, I was here when basically Galina and Medusa were presenting, and my fear is that one of the reasons that the opposition media, who is outside of Russia, is going to lose influences because we want them to talk in the way we're talking. But listen, we're not Russian citizens. I don't care about Russia. I don't care, but they should, because if they don't care about Russia, but they're there. And in my view, this story to allow people to find their own language in which they want to change their country, which is not going to be exactly the language from which we're coming, is a very important. And then comes the Kadri's question. Listen, European Union is really in a difficult situation. Before we have been having this conversation also in the European Council on Foreign Relations, we have been a missionary in 1990s for very good reasons, because European Union was seeing the world and we're seeing how we're going to transform the world. And then came the financial crisis, then came basically the wars, and we started to fear that the world is going to change us. So from missionary, we turned into a monastery. But it is not easy to defend a monastery. And as a result of it, my idea is that one of the things, for example, that we see is we are not going to change the opinion of the global south on the Russia-Ukrainian war. They don't care much, not so much that they support Russia, but they're not going to support our sanctions. They're not going to take our position. We should stop pretending that we can change their position. This is Europe's war, and we should be able on our own with the Americans to help Ukraine and to do it, and to expect that basically Brazilians are going to do it or the Chinese are going to do it is totally unrealistic. Secondly, it means that we should try to engage with these people on the things that matter for them. You cannot imagine to what extent European policy on vaccination has turned people against the EU. And I'm going to give you just one example, not in Africa, but in the Balkans. So European Union, trying to convince our populations, rightly so, that we care about them, said that they're going to be vaccination, and for a country like Macedonia, the people, the persons who gave the first vaccines was the Serbian president giving them Russian or Chinese vaccines. And by the way, the first people he gave them was a journalist. We're talking about 5,000, 10,000 vaccines, but all national leaders were afraid that if they're going to say that they're going to give to foreigners, while basically not all of their people are vaccinated, they're going to be attacked. To be honest, I have been talking also to the Austrian government. I said, listen, give 5,000. They said, you're right, but we cannot afford this politically. And this is the story. And of course, this is democracy. This is how it works. The division between citizens and not citizens is very important. But this symbolic politics stays. And suddenly, many things that we have done have disappeared. On East European side, and you are right that my colleague Tim Snyder has a point which I found extremely relevant and important. He said, all European Union was founded by the former colonial powers. All of them have been either former colonial powers, have been defeated like Germany, or acting like France. Only with the exception of these, because only Greece and Ireland were not colonial powers. Countries with a very strong anti-imperialist sentiment entered the European project. It has a good sides and bad sides. And the bad side is that we are much more intolerant towards diversity and so on. But also, we believed that we have been colonized. It is not by accident that the most profound reporter of the anti-colonial revolutions in Africa and other places was a Polish guy. It was Richard Kapuczynski. Because when he went to Africa, he said, don't tell me what is a colonialism. I'm a Pole. And his last book about imperium was about the Soviet Union. And this is one of the amazing books, because this is a book about Soviet Union in which there are no Russians. This was all these minority groups and so on and so on. I'm telling you because this type of historical and cultural traditions, they are not going to disappear. And as a result of it, European Union is going to renegotiate many things, not simply how we are producing ammunitions, but how we are basically renegotiating our histories. And as a result of it, probably it's going to be better. There was a famous American vice president, Dan Quayle, who in 1990 said, the future will be better tomorrow.
And we have to survive 2024 to talk to you in 2025 and listen to you to the concert again. Thank you.